January 17, 1943, the North African sun struggles to pierce the dust-laden horizon. A column of German infantry moves cautiously along a ridge near Kasserine Pass, their boots crunching over sand and stone. In the distance, a sudden crack splits the air, sharp, deafening. A hail of metal rakes through the advancing squad. Tracers streak like fiery serpents, catching the dust in a deadly glow. Soldiers dive into shallow cover, their faces etched with shock. The enemy is unseen, yet lethal in its presence a mechanical demon, the American M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Its fire chews through sandbags, shatters wooden crates, and punches clean holes through steel plating. Tanks thought invulnerable, reel under its wrath. The Germans had faced machine guns before, but this is different. It reaches farther, it hits harder, and it does not relent. For the men on that ridge, it is no longer a battlefield, but a crucible of fear, where every shadow could be their last dot, and in this crucible, a weapon was born, not just to fight, but to haunt. The question emerges, why did the Germans come to dread it so deeply? The story of the M2 Browning .50 caliber begins not on the battlefields of Europe or North Africa, but in the mind of a single man, John Moses Browning. By the 1910s, Browning had already transformed small arms design. His creations, the M1911 pistol, the Browning automatic rifle, had defined modern infantry firepower. Yet he envisioned something larger, something capable of reaching beyond the limits of contemporary machine guns. A weapon that could pierce light armor, stop vehicles, and dominate the skies. By 1921, Browning's vision materialized, a heavy machine gun chambered in .50 BMG Browning machine gun caliber. At a time when infantry rifles barely reached 500 meters with accuracy, this weapon could engage targets at over 1,800 meters. The U.S. Army quickly recognized its potential. Initially designed for anti-aircraft use, it was mounted atop trucks, armored vehicles, and eventually aircraft. Its belt-fed system allowed for sustained fire, and the recoil-compensating mechanism kept it surprisingly manageable despite the enormous round. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the M2 underwent iterative refinements. Early models, like the M1921, were heavy, cumbersome, and limited to fixed positions, yet each lighter barrels, improved feeding mechanisms, and better sights brought it closer to a versatile weapon that could dominate both air and land targets. By 1933, the U.S. military had standardized the M2 for multiple roles: aircraft-mounted and vehicle-mounted and defensive fortification use. The weapon's specifications were exceptional for the era. The M2 fired a .50 caliber cartridge weighing over 660 grains, traveling at speeds exceeding 2,900 feet per second. Its effective range against ground targets was over 1,800 meters, and it could penetrate up to 20 millimeters of armor at several hundred meters, enough to disable light vehicles and early tanks. Its cyclic rate of 450 rates, minus 450 to 600 rounds per minute, was slower than the German MG42, but the power of each round more than compensated. As Europe edged closer to war, the Germans had their own formidable machine guns, the MG34 and, later, the MG42. The MG34 was precise, fast-firing, and elegant in engineering, while the MG42 became infamous for its terrifying rate of fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute. Both weapons were optimized for suppressive fire and infantry defense, but against armor and aircraft, they lacked the sheer destructive power of the M2. In tests during the late 1930s, American engineers demonstrated that a single .50 caliber round could punch through German half-tracks, shatter light vehicles, and even tear through aircraft fuselages at range. The U.S. recognized that the M2 was not just a machine gun, it was a force multiplier. Mounted on tanks and jeeps, it became a mobile threat. On aircraft, it turned bombers and fighters into flying artillery platforms, capable of stripping the wings off enemy planes. Engineers and tacticians began imagining new doctrines: infantry that could strike at distance, vehicles that could defend themselves against air attack, and anti-aircraft networks that could reach beyond the capabilities of contemporary German firepower. Yet for all its promise, the M2 had limitations. Early models were heavy, over 84 kilograms for a tripod-mounted version, and required a team of men to operate effectively. Ammunition was bulky, and sustained fire caused barrels to overheat. Crews had to master rapid barrel changes and belt management. Despite these challenges, the potential was undeniable. In the hands of trained soldiers, the M2 could dominate fields of battle, turning static defensive positions into lethal zones. By 1940, the M2 was beginning to be deployed in combat scenarios. U.S. Army and Marine units trained extensively on its use, testing it against mock armored targets and simulating air raids. Early combat exercises revealed a terrifying truth: German-style infantry formations, designed to maneuver under the suppressive fire of lighter machine guns, were vulnerable. The .50 caliber could cut through ranks, disable vehicles, and create psychological shock among enemy troops unprepared for its reach and power. This was the stage upon which history would play out. The M2 was not a weapon invented for spectacle. It was spectacle. It was born from necessity, precision engineering, and foresight. Its introduction would challenge German doctrine, force adaptations in armor and tactics, and ultimately earn a reputation that terrified the Wehrmacht from North Africa to Normandy. It was no longer just a tool of war. It was war. It was a herald of the industrialized, mechanized battlefield that World War II would become. And soon, German soldiers would discover firsthand why this heavy machine gun was more than a nuisance. It was a lethal, almost unstoppable adversary. By late 1942, the M2 Browning was leaving the training grounds and entering the crucible of war. Its first major exposure to German forces came in the deserts of North Africa, where American and Allied troops faced the seasoned Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The vast open terrain of the Kasserine Pass and surrounding valleys amplified the weapon's strengths. Unlike the confined European forests, the desert offered long sight, allowing the .50 caliber to reach targets well beyond the effective range of standard German infantry weapons. American crews learned quickly that the M2 was not merely a defensive asset, mounted atop jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks. It became a mobile force multiplier. In one documented encounter, a platoon of U.S. armored scouts armed with M2s halted a German reconnaissance detachment advancing across a ridge. Tracer rounds cut through the haze, piercing the thin armor of the vehicles. German soldiers, unprepared for the M2's combination of accuracy and destructive power, were forced to scatter under fire. Casualties mounted rapidly, and the psychological impact was immediate. Reports from the German side describe confusion and frustration at being cut down before closing range, an unsettling experience for men trained to advance under fire. On the airfields and skies above, the M2's role was equally transformative. Aircraft-mounted M2 South on American fighters and bombers introduced a new threat that German pilots could not ignore. The .50 caliber could rip through fuselages, destroy engines, and puncture control surfaces, often with a single burst. Luftwaffe memoirs from pilots stationed in North Africa frequently remark on the M2's sudden appearance as a game-changer, particularly when American P-40 Warhawks and B-25 Mitchell bombers unleashed coordinated strafing runs. The Germans had to adjust tactics mid-flight, often pulling back to avoid these long-range high-velocity rounds. The weapon's psychological impact was as significant as its physical effects. Infantry soldiers recount the panic induced by the first hail of .50 caliber fire. In letters and diaries, German troops described the hailstorm of steel that seemed to come from nowhere, leaving nothing untouched: sand, stone, vehicles, and human bodies alike. Officers noted that small units became hesitant, movements slowed, and attacks were delayed. The M2's reputation spread quickly through word of mouth and official reports. It was not just a tool of destruction. It became a symbol of American technological superiority and tactical foresight. In Sicily and later Normandy, the M2 continued to demonstrate its versatility. Urban combat, with its narrow streets and fortified positions, presented challenges, yet the weapon adapted. Mounted on tanks and half-tracks, it provided suppressive fire against sniper nests, machine gun emplacements, and fortified windows. Its heavy rounds penetrated walls, doors, and light fortifications, enabling infantry to advance with reduced risk. The Germans, in turn, had to rethink urban engagement, realizing that traditional cover offered little protection from these large-caliber rounds. Even in defensive operations, the M2 proved invaluable. American units deployed it along perimeters to counter potential German armored incursions. The weapon's long range allowed gunners to engage approaching vehicles before they could bring their own weapons to bear. Combined with careful positioning and teamwork, the M2 transformed static positions into lethal zones of interlocking fire. German reconnaissance noted the emerging pattern where M2 South were present. Advances slowed, casualties rose, and morale dipped. These early encounters left an indelible mark on German tactical doctrine. Reports from field officers, collected post-engagement, reveal a mixture of respect and frustration. They recognized the M2 as a technical marvel, capable of inflicting disproportionate damage with minimal crew exposure. Yet they also faced the reality that conventional small arms and even some light anti-tank weapons could not reliably counter it. The Germans began developing countermeasures, including heavier armor, coordinated artillery fire, and avoidance tactics. But the fear of the .50 caliber had already taken root in the battlefield. By the time American forces advanced into mainland Europe, the M2 had achieved legendary status among German units. It was no longer merely a machine gun. It was a symbol of the changing nature of warfare, a weapon that combined engineering precision, raw firepower, and tactical flexibility. And yet, this was only the beginning. To truly understand its impact, one must examine the multiple angles of its deployment, how it shaped human experiences, battlefield strategies, and technological evolution across all theaters of war. For the soldiers who faced it, The M2.50 caliber was more than a machine gun. It was a harbinger of sudden death. German infantrymen, accustomed to the suppressive fire of MG-34s or the snap of rifles, found themselves vulnerable to a weapon that could strike from distances previously thought safe. Letters and diaries from North Africa described the chaos it wrought. A single well-placed burst could shred the cover of sandbags, punch through half-tracks, or tear apart a prone squad in an instant. Unlike lighter weapons, it required minimal aiming skill to inflict maximum damage, leaving German soldiers bewildered and demoralized. American gunners, in contrast, carried a sense of grim efficiency. Crews trained rigorously to coordinate fire, calculate ranges, and manage ammunition belts under the heat of combat. The rhythm of the M2 was almost hypnotic: short bursts, careful tracking, and the mechanical thunder of each round as it expelled from the barrel. Soldiers who manned the weapon spoke of a strange duality: fear of the weapon's recoil and awe at its lethality. For them it was both protector and predator, giving them a sense of power few other weapons could provide. The human toll was compounded by its psychological impact. Accounts from German medical units and battlefield reports repeatedly mention soldiers immobilized by the sound and sight of the .50 caliber rounds ripping through the air. Panic set in when advancing units realized that even trenches and light cover offered no sanctuary. Casualties were not just physical, they were mental. Fear spread faster than bullets, and entire units hesitated to move until suppressive fire could be neutralized, often at great cost. On the battlefield, the M2 revolutionized tactical thinking. Infantry formations that had been effective against conventional machine guns suddenly found themselves exposed. Open terrain, once an advantage for maneuver, became a trap when a .50 caliber gun could cover every approach. German tactics, which relied on coordinated advances and flanking maneuvers, had to be reconsidered. Commanders quickly discovered that the M2 could pin down units, disrupt cohesion, and force costly delays. Mounted on vehicles, it became a mobile pivot point. Half-tracks and jeeps could rapidly reposition M to south to cover vulnerable flanks or support infantry assaults. Tanks, equipped with secondary M2 mounts, could suppress anti-tank teams or infantry attempting to close in. The combination of mobility and firepower allowed small American units to punch above their weight, creating zones of lethal dominance with minimal manpower. In the desert campaigns, these tactics proved decisive. German reconnaissance columns were ambushed, armored vehicles disabled, and infantry units halted at ranges previously thought beyond danger. Even in urban combat, the M2 altered tactics. Its ability to penetrate walls and light fortifications meant that buildings were no longer safe havens for German soldiers. American units could lay down suppressive fire through windows or breach walls to clear rooms, forcing the enemy to rethink defensive positions. Commanders learned that where the M2 was deployed, careful reconnaissance and alternative routes were essential to avoid catastrophic losses. From a technological perspective, the M2.50 caliber was an engineering marvel of its time. Its design emphasized versatility without sacrificing power. The weapon could fire continuously at 450 to 600 rounds per minute, yet the recoil system ensured that even prolonged bursts were manageable for trained crews. Its effective range and armor-piercing capability surpassed anything the Germans could field in an equivalent light machine gun. The adaptability of the M2 was another critical factor. It could be mounted on tripods, vehicles, aircraft, or improvised defensive positions. Barrel changes were rapid, ammunition belts were straightforward to feed, and the gun maintained accuracy even under extreme conditions: desert heat, mud, or cold European winters. These features made it a reliable tool in every theater of war. German engineers and tacticians quickly recognized its superiority. Field tests in North Africa and later in Europe confirmed that no SMARM solution could match the penetration and range of the M2. Attempts to mitigate its impact required heavier armor, additional infantry support, or coordinated artillery fire. In essence, the M2 forced the enemy to innovate simply to survive its presence, altering the technological landscape of the battlefield. These three angles, human, tactical, and technological, begin to paint a picture of why the M2.50 caliber was not merely a weapon but a transformative force in World War II combat. It reshaped how soldiers experienced battle, how commanders planned maneuvers, and how engineers approached battlefield innovation. Commanders on both sides quickly realized that the M2 Browning .50 caliber demanded a re-evaluation of strategy. For American officers, it represented a reliable tool that could multiply the effectiveness of a small unit. Decisions on positioning, fire coordination, and combined arms integration increasingly revolved around the weapon's capabilities. Placing M2 south at choke points, securing high ground for overwatch, or pairing them with anti-tank teams amplified battlefield impact. Leadership emphasis shifted from sheer numbers to effective deployment of technological advantage. Highlighting the weapon's role as a force multiplier, German leaders faced a different challenge: Officers from platoon to corps level were forced to reconsider entrenched doctrines. Traditional German tactics, honed in Poland and France with rapid maneuvers and disciplined infantry advances, were suddenly vulnerable. After-action reports frequently cited the M2's devastating long-range fire as a primary factor in stalled attacks and mounting casualties. Some German commanders ordered flanking maneuvers at greater distances, increased use of artillery to suppress known M2 positions, and even tactical retreats to avoid exposure. The presence of the .50 caliber required anticipation, adaptation, and sometimes improvisation, qualities that were not always feasible in the heat of battle. Leadership decisions, once routine, became a delicate calculus of timing, terrain, and firepower. The German soldier's perspective underscores the M2's reputation as a feared instrument of war. Diaries, letters, and post-war memoirs reveal a combination of awe and terror. Infantry units reported that advancing across open terrain under .50 caliber fire was akin to crossing a gauntlet. Light vehicles were particularly vulnerable, and even armored half-tracks sometimes succumbed to sustained fire. In some accounts, German soldiers described the M2's rounds as flying hammers or metal storms, language that conveys both respect and dread. German technical reports also documented the weapon's effectiveness. Engineers noted that conventional machine guns could not reliably disable the same targets, and anti-tank rifles or light artillery often proved insufficient. The M2's combination of range, firepower, and versatility forced German forces to rethink both offensive and defensive operations. Field manuals were revised to emphasize cover, dispersion, and coordination with heavier weapons. Even seasoned soldiers came to accept that encountering an M2 meant fighting at a disadvantage until it could be neutralized. Beyond tactics and technology, the M2's influence was profoundly psychological. Fear, hesitation, and the anticipation of sudden destruction became as potent a weapon as the rounds themselves. Soldiers reported frozen moments before entering its line of fire, heartbeats measured against the rhythmic roar of the .50 caliber. German units, accustomed to disciplined maneuvers under heavy fire, sometimes faltered simply because of the gun's reputation. The psychological impact extended to morale at higher levels. Commanders recognized that the mere presence of M2 South could delay operations, disrupt coordinated attacks, and erode confidence among troops. Conversely, American soldiers often reported a heightened sense of security and assertiveness when operating the weapon. The duality of psychological effect, terror for the enemy, confidence for the operator, reinforced its battlefield significance. Even propaganda channels acknowledged its fearsome reputation. Allied newsreels and military communiques occasionally highlighted the M2's impact, framing it as a symbol of American ingenuity and industrial might. On the German side, discussions in intelligence reports and tactical evaluations underscored that this was not just a firearm, but a weapon that could dominate the mind as much as the body. By examining these 6 angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy perspective, and psychological, the full scope of the M2's impact becomes clear. It was more than metal and ammunition. It was a reshaper of human behavior, battlefield planning, and enemy morale. Its effectiveness was cumulative. Individual fear multiplied into tactical delays. Tactical delays amplified operational challenges, and operational challenges forced strategic reconsideration. The M2.50 caliber had entered the war as a heavy machine gun, but it emerged as a transformative force, redefining the relationship between man, weapon, and battlefield. And this transformation would be revealed most dramatically in the moments when the gun's power reached its zenith, during decisive clashes that would leave no doubt why the Germans came to hate it. February 1943. The Kasserine Pass in Tunisia had become a crucible for American forces. Freshly arrived troops, inexperienced in desert warfare, faced Rommel's battle-hardened Afrika Korps on a windswept ridge. A platoon of American soldiers positioned their M2 Browning .50 caliber atop a hat. The German infantry and armor approached, confident in their numerical superiority. Then the first burst erupted. Traces arced through the desert haze, cutting through the dust and chaos. A German scout car erupted in flames. Panicked soldiers dove behind scant cover. The M2's firepower was indiscriminate and unrelenting. Within minutes, what should have been a swift reconnaissance operation devolved into confusion. German units attempted to regroup and advance, but the M2 had already dictated the tempo. Tanks hesitated, infantry faltered, and the carefully planned assault began to unravel. The M2's effect was not just physical. It was tactical. American gunners, rotating barrels and tracking targets with precision, maintained continuous fire while adjusting angles to cover advancing flanks. German commanders, observing through binoculars, realized their formations were crumbling under the relentless hail. Attempts to return fire with MG-34s or even light artillery proved insufficient. The heavy caliber of the M2 allowed it to punch through half-tracks, disable light tanks, and shred infantry at ranges beyond effective German counterfire. Similar stories emerged across other theaters. In the jungles of Bougainville and the Pacific Islands, Marine units mounted M2s on landing crafts in fortified positions. Japanese infantry, accustomed to rapid infiltration and close-range combat, found themselves cut down at distance. The weapon's power to deny movement, destroy vehicles, and suppress enemy positions created a tactical advantage that extended beyond the numbers of men involved. One after-action report noted that an M2 team of 3 could hold off an entire platoon, buying time for reinforcements or evacuation. The Normandy landings in June 1944 further demonstrated the M2's decisive role. As American troops pushed inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, German defenders discovered that conventional machine gun nests were vulnerable not only to frontal assault but also to long-range M2 fire from armored units and mobile machine gun positions. The psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers hesitated in the open, delaying counterattacks and reducing cohesion. Artillery bombardments could not neutralize every M2 emplacement, and attempts to flank often encountered overlapping fields of fire. The weapon's presence forced a reconsideration of defensive planning, turning what should have been rapid German responses into measured, cautious maneuvers. In addition to infantry engagements, the M2 proved decisive against light armor. At multiple encounters along the Italian front, German half-tracks, armored cars, and even early Panzer models were disabled or destroyed by sustained .50 caliber fire. The weapon's armor-piercing rounds could penetrate frontal plates that previously seemed impervious to small arms. German crews reported moments of disbelief as their vehicles were rendered immobile by what they initially considered a secondary threat. Air combat further cemented the M2's reputation. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and B-25 bombers armed with M2 South strafed German supply lines, trains, and vehicles with devastating efficiency. The .50 caliber's combination of velocity, accuracy, and penetration meant that even lightly armored aircraft or transport vehicles were vulnerable at long range. Memoirs from Luftwaffe pilots recall low-flying raids where American fighters, M2 South blazing, destroyed fuel trucks, armored cars, and trucks before the enemy could mount a response. This consistent lethality across land and air theaters was unprecedented and created an enduring sense of dread. The cumulative effect of these engagements revealed the M2's defining characteristic, its ability to influence outcomes beyond its immediate destructive capability. German commanders had to reconsider the timing, formation, and approach of every advance. Infantrymen were forced to spread out, take longer routes, or delay maneuvers entirely. Entire operations were subtly reshaped by the presence of a single heavy machine gun. In essence, the M2 did more than kill. It dictated the rhythm of battle. It imposed its own tempo, forcing enemy units into defensive postures and giving American forces an edge disproportionate to the number of men operating it. By the spring of 1944, German troops had internalized its threat. Stories of halting assaults, immobilized tanks, and shattered infantry columns circulated widely among the ranks. Fear, efficiency, and mechanical precision combined in the M2 to create a weapon that could dominate the battlefield both materially and psychologically. By late 1944, the M2 Browning .50 caliber had become a weapon, feared across multiple theaters of World War II. Its decisive moments were not isolated incidents. By incidents, they were a pattern of destruction and influence, consistently reshaping engagements wherever it appeared. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American troops entrenched along critical points in the Ardennes relied heavily on M2s mounted atop jeeps and half-tracks. German armor and infantry columns, accustomed to rapid advances, encountered these mobile heavy machine guns for the first time in dense winter forests. The M2s cut through light armored vehicles, punctured fuel tanks, and shredded infantry formations advancing along narrow roads. Reports indicate that in a single day, one platoon's M2 team neutralized multiple Panzer IIAs and half-tracks, stalling a larger offensive for crucial hours. These hours allowed American forces to regroup, reinforce positions, and ultimately repel German advances on the Pacific theater. Marines on Peleliu and Iwo Jima employed M2 South to devastating effect against entrenched Japanese positions. Nestled on fortified ridges or atop landing crafts, the weapons unleashed precise long-range fire on assaulting infantry. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to hand-to-hand engagement and short-range defense, found themselves mowed down before reaching their objectives. Even bunkers and fortified positions, designed to resist lighter arms, succumbed to the M2's penetrating rounds. One official Marine after-action report noted that a 3% M2 team could disrupt the attack of an entire enemy company, buying invaluable time for reinforcements to secure flanks or evacuate wounded. The combination of statistics and first-hand accounts underscores the M2's unmatched efficiency. Infantry reports from Normandy in North Africa consistently recorded that a single weapon could inflict casualties equivalent to that of a squad of standard machine gunners. German records corroborate this. Captured logs from the Afrika Korps cite repeated encounters with an unusually powerful weapon, responsible for higher than expected losses and repeated tactical setbacks. While exact kill ratios varied by engagement, it is clear that the M2's presence alone forced German commanders to reconsider force allocation, exposure, and even morale maintenance. Tank crews and armored units faced similar challenges. Lightly armored half-tracks, reconnaissance vehicles, and early panzer models could be disabled at range, with the weapons rounds penetrating side and frontal armor that would normally resist standard machine gun fire. Field reports from the Italian campaign indicate multiple instances where small M2 teams halted the advance of mechanized columns, forcing German commanders to reroute or delay attacks under increasingly disadvantageous conditions. Air operations also highlighted the weapon's versatility. American P-51s and P-47s, armed with multiple M2s, conducted strafing runs on German convoys and airfields. Even low-level strafing, previously considered hazardous due to anti-aircraft fire, became survivable and devastatingly effective. German logistical support columns were regularly destroyed or delayed, creating a ripple effect across fronts. The M2 was no longer simply a defensive or secondary weapon. It had weaponed. It had become a strategic instrument capable of influencing campaign outcomes. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the M2's climax was its psychological dominance. German troops, already fatigued by prolonged combat, learned that encountering a .50 caliber often meant exposure to relentless fire before they could effectively respond. Entire squads would hesitate to move under its gaze. Commanders calculated that any aggressive maneuver would require artillery suppression, diversion, or flanking, or risky in the fluidity of battle. Its reputation spread faster than actual deployment. Fear became both anticipation and deterrent. In essence, the M2 had transcended its physical function to become a force multiplier through reputation alone. The cumulative effect of these decisive encounters was undeniable. The M2 dictated tempo, disrupted German doctrine, and inflicted disproportionate casualties. It forced a re-evaluation of tactics, reshaped infantry engagement, and amplified the effectiveness of relatively small American units. Commanders, soldiers, and even engineers came to recognize a singular truth. Wherever the M2 Browning .50 caliber appeared, the battlefield changed. Its firepower could not be ignored, its psychological effect could not be underestimated, and its presence often decided the outcome of engagements long before decisive blows were struck at. By the close of 1944, German reports contained repeated references to the American .50 caliber menace. It was no longer merely a tool. It had become an arbiter of battlefield strategy, a weapon whose influence was measured not just in rounds fired, but in decisions altered, movements delayed, and lives preserved or destroyed. The Germans hated it because it did not fight fairly. It dominated. It dictated terms, challenged conventional tactics, and left no place safe from its reach. And as the Allies prepared for final pushes into Germany, the M2's legacy was secure. Its moments of decisiveness had proven that a single weapon, when designed with foresight, deployed with skill, and integrated into a broader tactical doctrine, could alter the course of battle. The stage was set for the aftermath, the hard lessons, the losses, and the strategic transformations that followed. The battlefields where the M2 Browning .50 caliber had been deployed were left with tangible consequences. German infantry in light armor suffered not only material losses but a growing sense of vulnerability. Across North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, reports accumulated detailing the devastating effectiveness of the weapon. Casualty lists reflected more than numbers. They illustrated the weapon's ability to disrupt formations, slow advances, and demoralize troops in ways conventional machine guns could not. In Tunisia, after the engagements at Kasserine Pass, German field officers submitted detailed evaluations. They noted that infantry units encountering M2 fire often hesitated or took longer to advance, leading to missed opportunities and higher casualties. Reconnaissance vehicles, half-tracks, and early armored vehicles were particularly susceptible. Even when German troops attempted suppression with MG-34s or mortar, the M2's effective range and rate of fire allowed American teams to relocate, maintain cover, and continue inflicting damage. In effect, the M2 forced the Germans into a reactive posture rather than proactive maneuvers. Losses were not purely tactical. They had a psychological ripple effect. Units reported hesitation when approaching known M2 positions. Fear, once a personal response, became a collective phenomenon, affecting entire platoons. Diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the sense of helplessness against a weapon that could strike accurately at distances previously considered safe. Even elite units, trained for rapid assault, noted that the .50 caliber could disrupt carefully rehearsed strategies. American commanders, conversely, leveraged these effects with precision. The M2 became a central component of defensive and offensive doctrine, used to shape enemy movements, secure flanks, and protect vulnerable points. Its versatility allowed it to be deployed atop jeeps, half-tracks, tanks, and fixed emplacements, providing overlapping fields of fire and continuous suppression. By coordinating M2 teams with infantry assaults, artillery barrages, and armored maneuvers, commanders amplified its impact exponentially. German countermeasures emerged in response to these experiences. Field manuals began emphasizing dispersed formations, indirect approaches, and heavier reliance on artillery to suppress M2 positions. Engineers attempted to reinforce vehicles and light armor, while infantry adjusted tactics to avoid long-range exposure. However, these adaptations were limited. The weapon's mobility, combined with the Americans' operational discipline, meant that countermeasures often arrived too late, or only partially mitigated its effectiveness. The cumulative effect of these encounters also influenced German strategic thinking. High-level reports to Army Corps highlighted that the M2 was not simply a battlefield nuisance. It was a tactical game-changer. Commanders noted that traditional doctrines, optimized for speed and surprise, had to be reconsidered. Engagements that might have favored German forces were now balanced or even tipped by the presence of this single heavy machine gun. By the spring of 1944, the M2 had established a consistent pattern. Wherever it was deployed, enemy advances slowed, casualties increased, and morale wavered. Its reputation spread quickly among German units. Soldiers would warn each other about its placement. Officers adjusted plans around its known range and destructive potential. The combination of physical lethality and psychological dominance ensured that the weapon's impact extended far beyond the bullets fired on summary. The immediate aftermath of the M2's deployment was multifaceted. German losses, both material and human, were significant. Tactical planning required fundamental adjustment. Psychological pressure amplified the weapon's effectiveness. And American forces, understanding its unique advantages, integrated it into doctrine with efficiency and foresight. The stage was set for long-term implications. The evolution of tactics, adaptation of equipment, and the shaping of engagements in Europe and the Pacific as the war progressed. Into 1944 and 1945, the presence of the M2 Browning .50 caliber continued to shape operations across multiple theaters. German forces had learned that traditional tactics could no longer be relied upon. Infantry advances required increased reconnaissance, dispersed formations, and constant suppression with artillery or mortar to counter the threat posed by long-range high-velocity rounds. Even when heavier armor was employed, the M2's ability to penetrate light vehicles and disable critical components forced German engineers to adapt vehicle designs, a costly and time-consuming process that came too late to influence many battles. The strategic consequences were equally significant. The M2 allowed American forces to hold positions with fewer men, freeing units to be redeployed elsewhere. Its mobility and versatility enabled concentrated firepower to be applied wherever it was most needed. From urban streets in Normandy to the hills of Italy and the jungles of the Pacific, German commanders, faced with repeated failures to overcome M2 protected positions, were forced to reconsider force allocations, timing of offensives, and even operational priorities. In many cases, engagements that might have favored German forces were delayed or abandoned due to the presence of these weapons, highlighting the profound operational impact of a single well-deployed machine gun. In addition to battlefield consequences, the M2's influence extended to German morale and psychological resilience. Reports collected from soldiers, officers, and post-war interrogations frequently mentioned the weapon by name. It was described not merely as a tool of destruction but as a source of constant anxiety, an ever-present tank sheet, an ever-present threat that could strike anywhere, anytime. The cumulative effect of repeated exposure to its fire created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Even elite units, trained for speed, precision, and aggression, acknowledged that the M2 could neutralize their advantages in certain circumstances, forcing caution where none had existed before. Beyond immediate tactical and psychological effects, the M2 shaped post-combat analysis and doctrine. German after-action reports emphasized the need to address the long-range, high-velocity threat posed by heavy machine guns. Engineers, tacticians, and strategists studied encounters with the M2 to improve vehicle armor, modify formations, and develop suppression techniques. Yet despite these efforts, the weapon's combination of firepower, range, mobility, and psychological impact remained difficult to counter fully, ensuring that its reputation persisted through the closing stages of the war. American forces, conversely, recognized the strategic value of integrating the M2 into combined arms doctrine. It was not merely a defensive weapon but a central component of offensive operations. Infantry units could advance with confidence knowing that mobile heavy machine gun support covered their flanks. Armor columns could operate with added security. Air-ground coordination, with strafing runs and mobile suppression, magnified its effect across multiple engagements. The M2 was no longer simply a gun. It had become a cornerstone of tactical doctrine, a weapon whose presence reshaped both strategy and morale. By war's end, the Germans had come to view the M2 with a mixture of respect and fear. Its legacy endured not only in the numbers of vehicles destroyed or soldiers killed, but in the fundamental changes it forced upon battlefield planning and decision. The weapon had proven that technological advantage, when combined with disciplined deployment, could reshape combat dynamics in ways that numbers alone could not achieve. Ultimately, the M2 Browning .50 caliber left a dual legacy, a tangible record of destruction and a more subtle, a psychological imprint on both sides of the conflict. German soldiers feared it, American forces relied upon it. Its presence influenced everything from unit cohesion and tactical movement to strategic planning, shaping the course of campaigns and leaving an enduring mark on military history. And with these consequences firmly established, the story of the M2 reaches its final chapter, the reflection on what this weapon